I'm here, but because somebody's got a little 5-year-old's got a birthday today. And it's not Pat. Oh, good to see everybody again. It's been a long time since I've been here. Lots going on in the last few months. Got a lot of things have happened, but everything is moving in the right direction. We're hopefully, Lord willing, going to get to go back to China here in the next in November. I'm excited as all get out for that. Been a long time since I've been able to be there, but hopefully we can go back and maybe get back on a regular routine going. Also, hopefully have plans to go to Zimbabwe in April. And so I've never been to Africa before, so I'll bring you back some lion skins and rugs and things for you guys. I'll go on safari. Actually, that's what I'm trying to do, because Satan is called a roaring lion seeking to devour. So if I can kill him, that'd be great. But what we're going to do today, Donna was telling me last night that one of the things y'all been studying is just the Old and the New Testament, and how it's you're looking at things in the Old Testament that show up in the New Testament. And we're going to do a sermon in a little bit from now on that, about Jesus and his connections to the book of Genesis. But to do that, I thought we'd preface it, because I talked to a couple of you last night to make sure if my memory is just flawed. I was thinking, I think I've shown these Chinese characters here, but I found out that I have not. But I did show 2 or 3 in the middle of a sermon one time, and that's what was triggering my mind, because I knew I'd talked about it before. But in preparation to go to China, I do this presentation a lot in China. I've done it at least 100 times, if not more. And I say that because I want you to see something and know something. That when I put up these words and things, this is not a hypothetical that men have come up with this, and then you can kind of twist the Chinese words to make them. I present this before the Chinese people, and I tell them, you tell me the word, because I can't pronounce it. In fact, before I even put up what I say it is, I tell them, tell me what this word is in Chinese, and tell me what the word means. And they'll look at it and say, it just means garden. I said, look closely. Look a little closer. Because they don't see it like we do. They just seen the word, and they just learned to say that word. They don't put the pictograph together. And I want you to see how the pictograph comes together, and show you how that the Chinese people, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, in fact, thousands of years, believed in the book of Genesis. Their language was often based on words from the book of Genesis, even though the book of Genesis had not even been written yet. And I'll show you that in just a moment. But it's a tremendous, tremendous evidence, and it's a great door opener to be able to talk to the people in China. And it's led to, we baptized, a lot of people starting with this lesson. So I want you to kind of know the background of what's going on. Is that this is not hypothetical stuff. This is stuff that we've used on the ground, boots on the ground in China in my 33 years there. We do this a lot. And I've even done it in presentations in America. I remember going to Medtronic one time. One of our members was a member there, and she says, we have Bible studies there, and they always invite guests in. And I said, well, she said, can you come and be our guest and do your presentation on the Chinese characters? And they did. Well, it turned out, bunch of people who had been invited to come, they had some Chinese people there, and they brought them in. They were skeptics, and they didn't believe that what I was saying was true. And so I had the Chinese girl sit there, and every time I came to her, I said, tell me the word. And she would tell me the word. I got through with the presentation. She goes, he nailed it. And so I just kind of want you to know that this is not made up stuff. This is tremendous evidence to show that the words that we see in the Bible have been known for over 4,500 years. And so I just want you to see what we're doing here. When we talk about world populations, look at the populations of the world. We've got over 8 billion people in the earth right now. And India, of course, is now taken over as the number one. China was for a century was the largest country in the world. But now India has taken them over because the Chinese made a mistake of having a one-child policy for decades. And it cost them now. Now they've completely thrown that out. Now you can have 2, 3, or 4 kids if you want to, because they realized their mistake that they made, and they can't keep up. It's an older population, and the younger population can't support the older population. And they had to retire at 55 years of age in most parts of China. And so now they're extending that now. So kind of give you an idea. So the question is, where did they all come from? We talk about the populations of particularly the Orient. Where did everybody come from? When you look at the Chinese language, it's the oldest continuous language in the world. And what I mean by that is the languages, the letters and the things that you see, the words that they say, those things in the ancient Chinese date back 4,500 years. And that takes you back almost to the Tower of Babel, and we're going to show you that in just a moment where that came from. It was first written, the language, and it's still known. In fact, the Chinese people can still read the language from 4,500 years ago. They've simplified it. It's called the simplified Chinese, the Mandarin, but they can still read the old Chinese too. And so they take that. The inventors of the written language drew pictures. They call them pictographs. They call them other things, but the idea of a pictograph, a picture that painted a picture, and they would come up with a word that matched that image. And so simple pictures were combined to make more complex thoughts. And a lot of the Chinese will just they'll look at that word God there, and you say, wouldn't it be easier just to write God, G-O-D? But they draw pictures of it, and that would bring to their minds things. I want you to see, as we think about taking this, like that picture right there, when they would draw that, it meant mouth. You think of an open mouth. It also meant man, or man's mouth. But also, what would you think that would look like? It looks like legs, doesn't it? And that's what they would do. And they combine the two words. When you combine the two words, you have older brother. It's the word shun in the Chinese. And in this word, you put the mouth on top of the man's legs, and it meant elder brother. We'll show you in a few minutes later that it also meant the word violence, because the older brother was who? Cain, and what did he do? And they're going to show that. I'll show you that picture in just a moment. But here you got the mouthman, or the spokesperson, usually in the patriarchal world was the oldest brother. And so they would call that mouthman, or the spokesman for the family, was the older brother. And so you see how you combine the concepts of pictures and they come up with words for them. And so the well-known history of the common everyday things were used to make a word so people could remember it. They could look at that and go, oh yeah, that's what that means. And so when you look at things like that, long before we think of China, you often think of Buddha, because many of our studies over there are with Buddha people. The Buddha language has been there for 2,600 years. Not in China itself, but it was originated in India. It came into China around 50 BC. About 50 years before Jesus came is when they took the Buddha language into China itself. But it was in India where it was originated. And so that picture I want you to see the picture. 2000 BC was when the Chinese language was first invented. Those pictographs I just showed you, that was from 2,500 years ago. When did Moses write the book of Genesis? 1400 BC. So 1,100 years, over 1,000 years before the book of Moses, of Genesis, was ever written, the Chinese already had their language written out. That's important to remember, because you're going to see they knew the book of Genesis. A lot of their words came out of the concepts of the book of Genesis, even though the book of Genesis hadn't even been written yet. No, the creation story. They knew those stories already. All the stories you think about with the flood and all that, they already knew those stories. They've been handed down. That's going to be our very last word we're going to study. Been handed down from generation to generation. So if you look at the idea of the word Shangdi, that picture there in the green, that's Shangdi, that's God. And so the Shangdi was the god of China before Buddha. Now the word Shangdi meant one God, the God, the God. That's what Shangdi means the God. And so if you think of the God, not Buddha you walk into any Buddha temple and you'll find 500 gods. I've actually counted at least 500 gods in all the Buddha temples I've been in. You can go up there, you got a god of fertility, you got a god of war, you got a god of rain, you got a god of whatever it is. Whatever you happen to need, you go burn incense to that particular god. But it was called Buddha, the idea. So the idea is you had that Shangdi going all the way back, even before the book of Genesis was written. I want you to kind of remember that. During the first 3 dynasties of China, I won't go into all the details here, the Chinese people worshipped Shangdi. What I mean by dynasty, it means all kinds of emperors There was a whole bunch of emperors that fit in one dynasty, and a whole bunch of other emperors in another one, and another one. In other words, those three dynasties lasted over 1,000 years. And they believed in Shangdi, which means the God. And so Chinese found that fascinating. By the way, when I do this with a lot of people, the first words coming out of most of the Chinese people that I'm trying to study with, who are atheists for the most part, they say, that's just coincidence. By the time I show them 100 of these, they don't say coincidence anymore. It makes them have to think about it a little bit, at least challenge their thinking about these words. And so Buddha came in around 50 BC, so it's been there for that long. So the God of the Bible was reintroduced into China by a bunch of foreign missionaries that went in around 50 BC. I mean, missionaries, people who, later they came in after BC, but it was they introduced the God of the Bible. And I want you to see something. Many in China today believe that the Bible was a Western book. You ask them that, you'll ask them, where did this book come from? They'll say it came from America. Well, it wasn't a Western book. It didn't come from Europe either. And we all know when you start thinking about it not being an English book, the Bible was not written in English. It was written in Hebrew, which of course goes back to what part of the world? And Greek as well. It goes back into it's written in Egypt. The first writers were from Egypt and Babylon. And what I mean by that is, where was Moses from originally? He was taken into, as a baby, he was in Egypt, wasn't he? And so, he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And then the other writers were also from the Middle East. They were from people in that region. They were not Western people. So that's the thing I want to make sure they understand. So to show Chinese characters which demonstrate the same story will prove that the ancestors of the modern Chinese knew the same stories that are in the book of Genesis. That's my point. That's what we're going to try to accomplish. It's a great evidence that you can use even with your friends. There's a number of books been written about that. That I can show you the names of the books where I got a lot of this stuff myself, that were written by the Chinese people, that show that they believed and how they came to faith in the Bible was by looking at these Chinese characters. I'm not going to read all these stories because I hope that you already know most of them just for time's sake. This lesson usually goes for about 2 hours with the Chinese people, and then they usually want 2 hours beyond that. And so I don't know that you're ready for 4 hours of this. So what I'm going to do is ask that you remember these stories from the Bible. Most of you probably already know these stories of the Genesis 1 through 11. And so without having to sit and read about all this stuff, all through the book of Genesis chapter 11, you know that story about the Tower of Babel, don't you? What happened at the Tower of Babel when they decided that they wanted to stay together, when God told them to multiply and replenish the earth, and they didn't want to do that, so what did they decide to do on their own? Stay together. So to do that, they wanted to build a big tower up to heaven, and they wanted to be able to all hang together and have that same language and not split up. And so that was the concept. The Lord scattered them, in other words, and that's what I want you to remember. About 5,000 years ago was the story of the Tower of Babel. And so I want you to think about when that story started, about 5,000 years ago, the world's oldest written language, the Mandarin language, is 4,500 years old. In other words, it dates all the way back really to the Tower of Babel era. That's what I want you to remember. The languages were divided, and so the Chinese tongue probably started around that same time. God gave the Chinese language to a group of people who were then venturing going east. And so they would go toward the Orient or to the east. And so if you'll notice the location of the Tower of Babel, around the area where we would know of, Iraq, places like that, Iran and Iraq, in that area, around the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, in that region. And you'll notice the area as it goes, they migrate. God told them, to get out, to leave, to divide, go north, south, east, and west. And so you'll notice that all the different directions that people then ventured, because if you only spoke one language and you found a bunch of people that spoke your language, you're going to hang together. And all of a sudden you're talking to people who yesterday you were talking to and you understood, but now they don't understand them anymore. And so kind of picture that idea that you got all these little groups with all these different languages, and so they're naturally going to gravitate to each other and go a certain direction. And so that's obviously what happened. God scattered them to the four winds. And the Chinese people, which is what they became known as, migrated. And I want you to notice they migrated or they walked from the west to China. Look at the words I got underscored. I want you to see something. The Chinese would have migrated or walked from the west. They're over here, and they're going to go east. They're going to go to... Babylon is over here. Babel was over here, and they're going to go east, okay? Keep that picture in mind. They're going to go that direction. They're going to go east. Now, so that's going to give you an idea of when you come up with the word west, what they're thinking of. When they think of west, what they're thinking of. They're going to think back to that time when we had the Tower of Babel and so forth. So to migrate, it means to move. And here's our first Chinese word I want you to learn. To migrate or to move. Look at what it says. If you look at these words, how it pieces together. There's a great, there's a division, there's west, and there's walk. I want you to look carefully at all those various characters. Great and division and west, particularly look at west, and look at walking. And that word means to migrate. And you see how you put all those four characters together and you combine them? You can see them on the far right there. You can see how all four of those are put together. They draw them all, and it means to migrate or to walk in a direction, to go from one place to another. Okay? That being said, I want you to look at the word for to walk or to go west. The Chinese walked from the west after a great division. After they were divided and God said, scatter. So this great division took place. They walked from the west to the east. So now the Chinese are over in the east and they're thinking back west. So what are they thinking about? The Lord God formed man of the dust from the ground and breathed. By the way, we read this from the Chinese Bible so they can see it in their language, and it all works the same as it does in English. God formed the man from the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Look at that verse, Genesis 2, verse 7. Now look at how it's pieced together. Wonder what that says. What's that word when it says the Lord created man of dust from the ground and breathed in his nostrils the breath of life? He became a living being. To talk and to walk means to create. You look through those words and look at the characters of those words, and you'll see something as it begins to develop. To create, you'll see how the word talking and walking make the word create. But then what's interesting is the word to talk. There it is. There's that same word. And what does that word mean? Dust, breathing, a living dust breath or person. A living dust person is the first person to talk. That's how they would have seen that. And then you add walking to that, and then you have the word to create. So the creation story, to create, started with somebody who came alive, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. He became a living being, and then he could walk and talk. And that was the created being. It wasn't the Big Bang where you have the protozoa and the primordial soup, and there's something that comes out of the waters and then all of a sudden starts walking and talking. That's not what we're doing here. So that word first, we're looking at that word first. There's that word living again. That's just a diphthong, which means to live or be alive. And then you have that word for dust. Interesting concept for dust there. But then you also have that man. There's the legs and the man. A living dust man was the first man. What was Adam made from? The dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The Chinese understood that concept. When they were thinking of the word, would you have thought of the word first meaning a living dust man? You would have never come up with that in 1,000 years or 1 billion years, depending on if you're an atheist. A living dust man is the word for first. Now that's going to show us that living dust man, the first man, according to the Chinese language, 4,500 years ago, this was also believed in China. 1,100 years before Moses ever wrote Genesis chapter 1. They already knew these stories. Now, look at this one. Happy. Y'all recognize that first one on the left there? Shangdi. Y'all see Shangdi up there on the left side? That one I showed you a moment ago? You got Shangdi, God, and then you got the number 1. You can see the number 1 on top over the mouth over there. You got that mouth or man, and then you got a garden. One man in a garden with God is the word for happy. When was man the happiest who's ever been on the face of this earth? When he was alone with God. He was at one with God. There was no sin. He was He was made in God's image, and they walked and talked with each other every day in the garden. You talk about ultimate happiness. That's a beautiful, happy picture when there's no sin, there's no Satan, there's none of that. But it didn't always stay that way. Something divided man from God. Fellowship was lost when man sinned in the garden. There was a division now. There was a problem. They had an issue. Man's guilt separates him from God. And so something has to be done. Well, got to do something, so what did God come up with? It's an interesting word, that word for me. Look at the word me, and you have the word for the diphthong for, or the letters for hand, and then you have a lance for a knife. I've asked a lot of Chinese, does that word lance also mean like a knife? And they go, yeah, you can use it for a knife. So a hand holding a knife, and then you combine the hand holding a knife down there with me with a sheep. And if you have a hand killing a sheep, you have righteousness. That's my favorite Chinese word, by the way. Because I try to teach them, I want you to be righteous. And they go, well, I said, how do you get to be righteous? Something has to die. Something has to die for you to be righteous. And of course, in the old days, it was the animals. Of course, with Jesus Christ, that's our true righteousness. When they took a knife to him, as it were, and killed him, then we were made righteous by the life and the death of Jesus Christ. And so how interesting is that the word not guilty has to do with a hand holding a knife? How does that lead to not guilty? Looks like it's going to lead somebody very bad guilty. It's going to kill something. And they do, but they kill a sheep. And the killing of the sheep leads to the righteousness of man. Kind of interesting to me. The Chinese people are impressed with that one, by the way. Now look at the Garden of Eden. We're going to come back to this concept. Remember what I told you, they migrated from the west to the east? Now here they are over in the east now, and they're looking back, and they're trying to think for a word for west. They're trying to think of a word for west. There it is. What's going to be, and here we are in China, what's a good word for west, going back to where we were before? Eden was east for Moses. Moses, when he writes this, it was east for Moses, Eden was, because he was over in Egypt, or over in that region where they were from was that way. So how did they come up with it? God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Look at that word for west. Look at how you piece it together. You've got that word one over the top of the legs, one over the top of the legs, and then you've got an enclosure or a garden. One person in a garden is what they thought of for west. When they're over here in China, they're thinking of the word for west. They're thinking, there was somebody over there in that garden in the east. But their word, going west from China, that's their word. They think of where's? They think of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Okay? At least that's a concept that could be possible. That's what. How else would you come up with that word, thinking of that being west, a man in a garden? What does that have to do with it? The first man, I like this word, he desires or needs a woman. This is my favorite story with Benita. A man needs a woman. We won't go to all that story. Adam found no one like himself after he named all the animals. Y'all already know that story, so I won't take time to read it. And then God put the man to sleep, and he took from his bones, took a rib, and made Adam. And so, if he's got this taken woman, because she was taken out of the man, the first man needs this woman. What do we got? God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper suited for him. This is going to be an interesting one. Look at that word for want or to desire or something that's needed or suitable or necessary. You can start looking at those words again. You kind of already see that word west up there in the top. And you got the west, one man in a garden, combined with a woman, is the word for desire or to want or to have found necessary. So he needed or desired to have someone like unto him. So they took that man in the garden and combined it with a woman and came up with that word for necessary or desire. That's pretty fascinating. How else would you come up with that word? But then what's interesting is look at how that came together, that word west. We remember there's one man in the garden. And then you combine it with a woman and you've got that story. That's where the word desire would come from. And so Again, you might say coincidence. Well, you're really stretching your imagination to call it all of these coincidence, especially when it was 1,100 years before Genesis was ever even written. God said it is not good that man should be alone. So we have that word beginning, but it's interesting. It's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper suited for him. But how did you get the word beginning or first with the number 2? 2 people is the word for beginning. When he began time, there was 2 people that he made. He made Adam and then he made Eve, and he didn't make anybody beyond that. He let them then procreate. He obviously made everybody, but just the idea that he created them whole, there was these 2 that were the beginning or the first of the earth. But then we know the story of the 2 trees in the garden. We have the tree of life, and we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or my mother called it the Kogi tree, knowledge of good and evil. So that was a Kogi tree. But you have these 2 gardens, or these 2 trees that are in the garden. So how many special trees were there in the middle of the garden? There was 2. So if that's true, then let's look and see what that says or what that means. Those 2 trees are going to be found in lots and lots of words in China. I'm going to show you a picture, at least 1 or 2 of them in a minute. Everywhere I go, I'm always looking for, because I don't read Chinese, but I can see a picture of 2 trees, and it's everywhere. I'll show you why I mean that. Look at the word for forbidden. Don't do this. It's forbidden. You cannot do this. Well, what is it you can't do? Well, there's 2 trees at the top, and then the one on the bottom is, the word is for command. I command you not to do something. But 2 trees are the picture of it. What did the Chinese people, thinking of their language, why did they bring in 2 trees for this? And they do it a lot. It's their word for forbidden. You can't do something. Well, what is it you can't do? Here's a picture I took when I was there. And this is not everywhere because they smoke everywhere. But just no smoking, at least that particular one, you see the 2 trees, forbidden to smoke, no smoking. They don't have that picture a whole lot of places. They do it in hotels. But what they do have everywhere is no spitting. They have that forbidden, no, and then the word for spit, no spitting. And so that's in a lot of places. I wish they'd had no bathrooming on the sidewalk. But the woman in the forbidden fruit, so you can see that picture where she was told not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then she gets into this discussion with the serpent, and the woman tells the serpent, we can eat of the fruit, we may take of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, if you take of it or put your hands on it, death will come to you. So we know that story. But what do we take from that? When the serpent said, death will not certainly come to you. You will not surely die, as the New King James puts it, right? And so the woman and the forbidden fruit, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to make one wise. When she puts those together, what does she have? There's that word to covet or to desire. The two trees and the woman. And then you have the 2 trees and the woman. Means to covet or to desire. They knew that they were naked. They knew that they had broken God's law. And so the word to covet or to desire, she saw that the tree was good and desired to have it, and so she took of it and ate. And so the woman with the 2 trees is their word for desire to covet. Kind of interesting, isn't it? And then you take the word devil. See if y'all can piece this one together. Now that kind of got you into this groove here of looking at the pictures and saying, what does that mean? What does that little picture mean? Well, let's just look at the word for devil. Kind of look at the picture there and kind of see how you piece that together, the life motion up there at the top, that little diphthong. And then you've got that word for secret or private. You can see that down below, off to the right bottom side. And then you got that garden there picture again. So the devil is life or something is secret in the garden. He's hiding in the trees, as it were, and he's talking to the woman in the garden. And then there's man. There's woman or man, Adam and Eve. And so the word devil has something to do with something secret in a garden with a man. But you put that together with the word for tempter, which Satan is. And you have the devil, the living motion, the secret garden of the man in the garden with the devil. And there's those two trees again. See the two trees? And then you have the word for cover. So under the cover of the trees, as it were, they were in the garden, and you have the word for tempter. They came up with this word for devil with two trees in a garden. And that's where, of course, they knew the story. It had been coming down for generations. The stories of Adam and Eve were known by word of mouth for hundreds of years. The Chinese people connected the devil with a garden and two trees. Interesting scenario. But then how about that word, after eating the fruit, they realized they were naked. Look at the word for naked. Get a good look at it, and then you're going to see something. What does the word naked come from? You put the word man and fruit together. This is before fruit of the loom. You took the word man and fruit, and you come up with the word for naked. Or, another word for naked, same concept, is clothing plus fruit is the word for naked. Now, how do you get naked out of clothing and fruit? Well, it's because when they were naked, then they had to be clothed, and so they knew they were naked, and they had to do something about it, and so then they put clothes on. But that's their word for naked. I don't know how they came up with that, but they did. Now, how else would they have done something like that if they didn't know the stories that were already well known before Moses ever wrote Genesis? In Genesis chapter 3, she took of the fruit, and we already know the story, multiply your pain, and pain you will bear children. Some of you women can go back and curse Eve for this. Because the word pain, if you look at it, you see the two trees again? Yeah, there's a piece of fruit, as it were, among the trees, and that's where the word for pain. How do you get pain with two trees and something called just a piece of something? And so the concept is among the two trees, you have your choice, and if you eat of this one, you eat it and you're going to have pain in childbirth. Well, not to be outdone, the man had to come up with something too. So from the sweat of his brow, he's going to have sorrow, the Bible tells us. He's going to have sorrow and pain. The word sorrow, you will get your food from your life. Thorns and weeds will come up, and the plants of the field will be your food. So you look at that word for sorrow, and it means weeds from ancient times. The word weeds goes back into ancient times, and so man came up with the word for sorrow, thinking that's when I had to go work among the thorns and the thistles and the weeds of the world to get my food. The first murder, we all know the story of Cain and Abel, so I'm not going to read it all to you. But Cain made an attack on his brother Abel and put him to death. So the first murder was Cain trying to kill his brother. The older brother, Cain, killed the younger brother, Abel. Now, to see all of that, let's look and see how they put that together, the concept of that. Well, you have the eldest son, the word Shun, that I mentioned a while ago. The chief spokesman, the older brother was the chief spokesman, the mouth man for the thing. And so you have that older brother. And then that older brother, the Bible tells us that Cain, when he was terrified, he phrased, anybody sees me, they're going to kill me. And God says, no, I'm going to put a mark on you. So look and see what happens when you get eldest son. The word cruel or violent is the same word as eldest son, Shun. You pronounce it exactly the same. And then you have the mark. You see X marks the spot on the top? That's the idea, is that God put a mark on Cain, so he was the oldest son who killed his brother, and that's the word for violent or cruel. And it even implies in the Chinese language for murdering or killing someone. And so, interesting how you put all that together. The first older brother in the Bible was violent. The elder son, he was violent. And again, both words are pronounced Shun. And they came up with that word for elder son and violent at the same time. They thought of the older brother, and they thought of somebody who was cruel. Noah and his wife and his three sons. I'm not going to read the whole story. You guys know the story of Noah and the ark and the flood and all of that stuff. So they've never read it. So you have to take time to read all this stuff to them. And so we talked about the story of the great flood, the building of the ark and so forth. And we saw the people ultimately that there was Noah and his wife, his three sons, and their wives. How many you got here? You got 8 people. Okay? Now this is really an interesting story. 8 people on a boat. The great world flood, Noah and his wife, their sons. You keep reading that story and you can see all the picture of the great flood and how we finish it up in verse 18. See all that. And after you get that, after we read that story, I say, now let's look and see something. What is the word for boat? And they'll tell you the word for boat in the Mandarin language. It's that. And I say, now interesting, you take that word boat, and somehow it's going to be a large ship. Especially when you have 8 people on a boat makes a large ship. How does 8 people on a boat? I mean, I've gone fishing with 8 people on a boat. It wasn't a ship. It was a boat, and you go fishing on the boat. And you can take a pontoon. That's hardly called a large ship. But that's their word for a large ship that we would know as would be a large ship, you know, a battleship or something. But you have 8 people on a boat? What in the world, and how in the world would you come up with a large ship being just 8 people on a boat? But look at that, how you have that word large ship. 8 people on a boat means a large ship. 8 people united on the earth is their word for total. After the flood, how many people were on the earth? What was the total population of the earth? 8 people. Their word for total was 8 united on the earth. They were all together. They weren't in sin. They lived through the flood. They were God's people. And then you have that word for total, 8 united on the earth, combine it with water, and it's the word for flood. Those 8 people with water means the word for flood. I got hundreds of these. And I want you just to see that how did the ancient people of China know these things? They didn't have a Bible. It's just an interesting scenario that you have that. But how did they know it? And here's that word I told you I was going to do, handing it down by verbal communication. They were writing these things down. Well, sometimes they were writing, they had a written language, but they were handing it down from one generation to the next. In the ancient days, most people were illiterate, or they just handed things down verbally from one generation to the next. And so when we think about handing it down, in fact, I want to go back and look at that. To hand it down, the 8 people on the water, the mouth person, means to hand down, to pass down from one generation to the next. And so when they were all united on the earth, then they had that story, and then they start passing it down. And for 1,100 years, from 4,500 years before Moses ever wrote the Bible, they knew these stories, and then Moses would write it, and then that language has continued all the way to today. It's the oldest continuous written language in the history of the world. And so people today in China can still read that old ancient Chinese. They've updated it some, but it's still there. And they can read those stories, they can see those pictographs, and they have those stories. And so I wanted you to see we must hand the good news down to the next generation. And that is the evidence for the Bible. I'll stop right there. I could keep going. In China, they said, more. So I figured you guys already probably had enough. But I wanted you to see that because it'll play into my sermon in just a few minutes. Just the idea of the evidence that we have to support that. We have one of our members has taken his daughter today. She's a freshman. He's taken her to Harvard University to start school in political science. And I fear for her soul to go to Harvard and study for political science. But because what they do is they take you and they destroy your faith. And so I worry about things like that. But take confidence in the Bible that you own. There's lots and lots of evidence. That's just one of many ways we could prove that the Bible is from God. And we'll look at some others here in just a moment as we study the book of Genesis. Any questions you guys got? We'll take time now to answer those questions if you have any. Yeah, John?
How would you respond to somebody who would say that Genesis 1 through 11 actually came from the Chinese?
That they came from the Chinese?
They came from the Chinese instead of Moses being inspired to write it.
Well, that would be hard to think Moses would take that from the Chinese people. I don't know how. They've never asked me that question. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. Well, I would say it was written down by the hand of God, obviously, and so the Chinese people didn't write the Bible. They wouldn't even have thought to write the Bible. They already knew. Yeah, it already does. Good question. Hey, Larry?
Did any of the Chinese ever say that they were curious about where all that scratching came from, or how they came up with that. They just accepted the pictograph without really having any curiosity.
They don't look at the pictures. They're not trained to look at those pictures and see what I just showed you. They look at that and go, it's just the word. That's how we look at the letter A and don't even wonder how it came. Where'd you get the letter A or the letter B? We don't think that way. We just go, that A-N-D means and. You just look at it and you don't consider how it all puts together. And they do the same thing. They look at the picture and they're just befuddled when I show them. I never broke that word down. I never saw that. So it's interesting when you're actually teaching them their own language, and I don't know anything about it. So it's interesting. Good question. Any other questions? Well, I thank most of you for staying awake. Okay, well, we'll prepare for our worship service in a little bit.